Okay, so my name is Emma Banks. I'm the Secondary Digital Learning Specialist at the Department of Education. And here joining me co-hosting is John, and I will let him introduce himself before we get going.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Graham. I'm the Elementary Digital Learning Specialist at the Department of Education. And we are excited today to be continuing our Remote Learning 101 series, moving on from Module 1 into Module 2. So this will be a 2-week cycle that we'll be going through. So between today, tomorrow, and Thursday, we're going to be having 3 sessions in succession. We have had some people ask about accessing these videos, which they will be available. Module 1 videos aren't available quite yet on the DOE website, but they will be shortly. And I think any of these, if you want to, jump in or access them at another point in time, they do have certainly a level of standaloneness, I could say. So you could certainly access them at any time, but I know some people will be interested in, both specific topics, but also going through and doing the whole series. So the goal is to, once we're all done, have them all available so folks can access them. So if you have any questions about that, certainly it's something you can add in the chat as we go, and we'll try to answer those.
Awesome. Yeah, so just a quick overview of Module 2. Like John said, it's going to be 2 weeks. This week we'll be doing Part 1, 2, and 3, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Today we are getting into Part 1, which will be instructional models and best practices. In week 2, there'll be another Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday series. And this schedule, I've been attaching to the email that I'm sending with the slide deck at the end of these sessions. So if you registered for the session, which you did because you're here, you will get an email from me that has the slide deck in it, as well as this entire layout of schedule. That way you don't have to try to rush to take notes on it or anything like that. So today we are going to be talking about instructional models and best practices for designing remote learning. And we're going to start with just a few models for designing remote learning. And then we'll move into some of the best practices. So we're going to introduce 3 different models today, some of which you are probably familiar with, at least in concept, but we'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the frameworks behind them and why they're useful in a remote setting in particular. So I want to start with backward design, also known as understanding by design. And this is basically the process of flipping what you would traditionally design. Some of you might already be doing this in the face-to-face classroom, but this particular model is a great practice for remote learning because you're kind of where there's so many tools and resources you can use. Starting with your desired learning outcomes can be a really great way to filter through that process of what tool might I use and why. And so in backwards design, if you're not familiar with it, you want to think about what you want to identify your desired learning outcomes as your first step, and think about what your students should hear and see and read and view otherwise, and explore all of those kinds of different things. What knowledge and skills do you want them to master? And what are the big ideas and the enduring understandings that you want them to retain? Then you'll move into determining what you're going to accept as evidence of that learning. I think that this is something that a lot of people have had to shift their perspective about a little bit in the past few months of, what does learning look like in a remote setting? Having a student sit down and take a multiple choice exam may not be the best way to demonstrate their learning because you may not be right there watching them. So you can't really tell that they're not engaging with other resources. So how might you change that to kind of provide a more thorough way for you to understand their learning? And then you're going to want to get into the planning of instruction and learning experiences. And then you're going to want to think about, what do they need to be successful? And what activities do you want them to engage in to obtain that knowledge and skill? And so then that's when you can start getting into like your tool selection, like what tool might be a good use for this or a good fit for this activity or this lesson. And by using that framework, it can kind of narrow down the noise that happens when you're trying to design a remote lesson, looking at all the different resources, all the different tools. All those things can be a lot, it's a heavy cognitive load. So starting with your outcomes and moving backwards can be a really great way to scaffold that. I shared that this slide deck is going to be shared out. These are all live links to resources that if you're interested in exploring backwards design or understanding by design, however you're most familiar with it, that you would explore some of these resources. They're really great. This in particular, the second one here, the backwards design template, moving my mouse on my second screen so you're not seeing my mouse, I'm sorry. The backwards design template here is like a framework that you can fill in to walk you through the backward design template if you're interested. I'm just going to click on that to kind of show you what that looks like before we move on. Maybe. Oh, here it goes. And I got to put it where you can see it. All right, so this is just a basic Word document that has some table fields that you can kind of fill in. So you've got, your established goal, your understandings, essential questions, and so you can kind of walk through these 3 stages of the backwards design process to dig a little bit deeper into this. So this is linked in the presentation that we'll be emailing out at the end of the session. So that's a really great place to kind of get an in-depth exploration. And then there's the simple guide to kind of just walk through what the process is with the 3 stages. And the third one is a really in-depth exploration of backwards design and kind of how the framework works in the classroom in some different ways. Okay, so I know it's a lot about backwards design, but you can that's one of 3 models that we're going to talk about. And we're going to move into the flipped classroom model. This one, thankfully, is a relatively simple model. And it's just kind of that idea that you would spend out of class time doing more of the preparation for the really engaging discussions and the hands-on components that you would have students go through. So instead of having when you have an in-person class, you might have students, okay, we're going to take the next 30 minutes and we're going to read this segment. And then we're going to come together and we're going to collaborate or talk or reflect or however it's set up. So instead of bringing your class together in a synchronous environment to have them go through an activity like reading something or watching something, you would have them do that on their own time and then come to the classroom prepared to kind of engage in a discussion about it. And so that can kind of help with some of the engagement struggles that people are experiencing in the synchronous type of sessions with video conferencing, is having some of that prep work outside of the classroom, which of course that comes with its own struggles and challenges. And there are some resources that we've kind of gotten here that can help guide some of the challenges that can come along with the flipped model, but that can also help you to really leverage it in a remote learning setting so that you have engaging experiences with your students when you do come together synchronously. And then the third model, this is another one that there's a high likelihood that a lot of you are already engaging in a face-to-face environment. And this is that idea of making something problem-based or problem-focused, having students create a real-world solution. One of the pieces of emphasis on remote learning is the real-time global collaboration that is possible when you have students connected in a digital world. They no longer are limited just to your classroom, they're officially engaged with the rest of the world. So finding ways to make that productive and use that to increase engagement. Student motivation happens a lot when they feel like they're actually doing something for the greater good or that's bigger than themselves. So anytime you can kind of bring in that type of problem-based learning, you can really have a lot more student motivation and autonomy. They will be more, they'll have more desire to actually engage with these kinds of things themselves if they feel like they're solving a problem. So in a traditional learning environment, you'd be told what you need to know, you memorize it, and then you're assigned a problem to demonstrate that you know how to solve the problem. And the problem-based would be that you're assigned a problem, and then you would work to figure out what you need to learn in order to solve the problem, and then you would come up with the solution. And again, we've got some more resources here talking about problem-based learning. Particularly, I really enjoyed the third resource, the second resource of implementing problem-based learning across content areas, because this kind of gets into some of the different ways that you might implement this in a different contexts, whether it's history or world language or things of that nature. So I'm going to, at this point, pause and just see if there are any questions about these three models. There's a lot to dig into here, so feel free once you get the slide deck to kind of dig into the resources and explore a little bit more. But I'd love to just pause and reflect for a few moments and see if anyone has any thoughts or questions regarding these three before we kind of shift gears and get into some instructional design best practices. I haven't seen the chat, so I don't know if anything has come up in there yet.
Nothing in terms of questions in the chat so far.
Well, I have a question. Will these kind of models will help me to prepare for distance learning?
Yes.
Because I use the backward design since many years, and but I wanted to make sure that what I have is applicable to distance learning. Or should I cut material because we're not face to face? I mean, those kind of things. Look at that, adjusting the content.
Yep, so that's a really great point. So if you have been using backwards design for a while and you're kind of wondering if the model that you're using is relevant to the remote setting without adaptation, I would say chances are that there's probably some adaptation that will be necessary for it to have the same effect or impact. There's a lot of reasons why. Some of them we'll get into with some of these best practices for instructional design. But some of them are considering like the cognitive load of your students, that when they're reading all of this stuff, you know, if you're thinking about something that you would read to them and then you're going to just take that and post it online and have them read it, then you might want, like, that might be something where you would rethink it, because depending on the age level of your students or their, you know, their cognitive abilities, like, you have to think about some of those different things depending on what the age group and things of that nature. So chances are your blended model in its structure is great, but you probably will need to either pare it down or adapt it so that it's a bit more engaging. Like if you had in-person activities where students were going to collaborate, then that's a super effective way to learn in a remote environment. It's just now you have to think about which tools you would use to make that happen, because that's something that would have to be facilitated. Instead of just being able to have your students turn and talk in the classroom, you would have to kind of either put them into breakout rooms or, you know, set them up so that they have roles where they're, you know, having an instant messaging chat, but they know like which role they're assigned to, so they know how to contribute appropriately. Some of those kinds of things can really make a difference, but chances are if you have a backwards design framework for a lesson or a unit, that's your, I'd say that's like your bones of your remote structure, and just kind of looking at how you need to adapt that would be a good place to start.
Thank you.
That's helpful. Any other thoughts or questions about flipped classrooms or blended learning or using problem-based learning in a remote environment?
Yeah, I have a quick question. I'm guessing I probably know the answer, but we're right now required to plan for 3 different possible models for the fall, and we haven't heard much as far as where things are in the decision-making process. Do you, being connected to Augusta Department of Education, have a general feel that this is something that we're all going to need to do? Because this is quite a challenge in a lot of ways. And when you're doing this, can you think in the context a little bit? I represent people from the career and technical centers, where this can be maybe, I don't want to say we're unique and we're different, but in a lot of ways we're unique and we're different. And a lot of our problem solving has to do a lot with hardware, large tools, a lot of safety requirements. And so it's really not a turn and talk. It's if you could just keep that in mind as we go through, any tips that would be relevant and any insight you have with what we might really be looking at having to do in the fall would be very helpful.
Yeah, those are great thoughts and questions as well. Sadly, we don't have the magical answer. I wish that we did, but I do think that there are going to be a lot of places that remote learning is not going to just go away in the fall. So I think that that's kind of one of the thoughts behind this Remote Learning 101 piece, is that now that people have had experience with remote learning, it's kind of looking at how things have gone and preparing for how we might do it better. There are some, I like to bring up the idea that there are, because I've heard it, across the state, that there are some students who are, they're exceeding in this environment where they were not before. In class or in school structures were not conducive for their learning environment. So they're actually making greater learning gains in these times than what they were in school. So I think that there's real value in kind of keeping that idea in the back of our minds as we move forward, because I think even once we go back all the way to school and things are back to quote unquote normal, that there is real value in this remote learning environment for some students. So kind of understanding how we might offer a really useful experience for anyone who might be provided with that opportunity in the future is definitely something worth keeping in mind. And thank you for the point about the career and technical education, because I know that's something that is a real struggle, or things like lab sciences and things like any of those really hands-on, tasks. So that's something that we'll definitely try to keep in mind.
And I think one of the considerations for CT specifically, just because I have said in some sessions that I've had CT folks with those concerns, and I think what many of them found to be most productive for them was to be connecting with like individuals. And I think that's the case with all levels, whether it's our like content or like grade levels and things like that. So certainly if you're able to connect with other CT teachers that are trying to do, going through the same struggles, I think in terms of problem solving, it's a little bit easier that way. So that would be one of my suggestions, just because what might, even within a CTE program, what might work for resolving video production challenges isn't going to work for a culinary arts program.
Any other thoughts or questions about some of these instructional design frameworks?
Yeah, I had a question. I teach a high school special education behavior-based program, and some of this doing work outside of the classroom environment. I totally see your point about some kids thriving. I have one or two in my program who have done quite well in this format, and it's kind of given me cause to think about what traditional schools barriers have put up for them. But the idea of having kids in a breakout room that isn't monitored by staff or even responsible for preparing material ahead of time is really not something that collectively they've done really well with. In fact, our model has been to move away from things like homework. And now that's really what we're providing with them a lot of the time. And like I said, credit due where they've succeeded. But the idea of expecting a group of students with not only behavioral, but potentially cognitive issues, as well as social economic issues as far as support in the home to engage in this material, I'm curious how that will relate to all this.
Yeah, that's certainly a very valid thought and concern. I think that anytime that a tutoring model can be used, obviously staffing is always a problem, but having that, one of the things about remote learning is that idea that class size really should be smaller when possible, so that you can give more attention to students where they need it. So obviously some of those things are kind of out of people's hands, so we do the best with what we have, but I could definitely see some of your concerns. Some of the resources that are in that slide deck do address some of those things, like how you can kind of I don't want to say monitor it, but how you can try to help families navigate that situation outside of the classroom. So and some of those resources might help with that. Anyone else before we move on? Okay. If anyone thinks of anything that's a burning question that they just thought of in the last moment, feel free to type it in the chat and we can get to it, come back around to it. Okay, so I feel like, I'm not sharing my screen still, or am I?
You are.
Okay, thank you. I have two screens going, so I'm getting a little lost between the two. Awesome. I just gotta find my PowerPoint, you guys, sorry. Here we are. All right, so now we are going to move into some instructional design practices for remote learning. And some of these are going to seem, they'll be very familiar to you. These are kind of the ones that have been pointed out as the most important in a remote learning context. So we'll kind of delve into some of the considerations to keep in mind, and then we'll talk a little bit more. So the first one is instructional time. You want to consider the attention span of your learners, the cognitive load that they're under, the modality that they're engaging in, is it synchronous or asynchronous? And then based on those things, you really want to set reasonable expectations for instructional time and adjust your materials dependent on the attention span and the cognitive load of your learners. So Eunice kind of asked that idea of if her backwards design template would work the same in the remote environment. And some of these things would be things you would want to keep in mind, just due to the idea that your students are now engaging with you through a device. And so there's some things that come along with that, as we all are well aware, lots of distractions and other things that can really decrease your attention span and increase the cognitive load that you have kind of engaging with materials. So anything that you can do to kind of mitigate some of those issues is definitely a best practice. Increasing connection to families and students whenever possible. You'll want to consider the methods that you're going to use for communication. Try to use just a few, like 1 or 2, maybe 3, depending on how you're communicating with your families and your students, and try not to change them up too much. Consistency is key with maintaining that connection. It's a lot of C's. Determine the models that you're going to use for communication. If you're going to have office hours, morning meetings, read alouds, are you going to have a lunch hour that's just kind of informal where they can pop in and you all have lunch together? Are you doing individual check-ins? Things of that nature. And then always keep in mind the purpose of your communication. Try to be purposeful with communication, even if that purpose is to just be fun and share out something positive. That is totally a purposeful use of communication. But just always consider that purpose when you're going to select your method and picking your models. And I already mentioned that consistency is key. Try to make sure that you're using a consistent method of communication so that the amount of bouncing around that families and parents have to do will be less. Student engagement, consider using varied instructional strategies, creating creating multiple opportunities for students to reach an outcome. I was trying to think of an analogy earlier, and of course I was failing miserably, but just creating as much variety for them to still make it to that end point and learn the same things along the way. You know, the more paths that they can have to the learning, the better. And that plays into that idea that student motivation is absolutely critical for their engagement. They have to be motivated in a remote learning environment. You know, unless they have a parent who is willing to just sit there and make sure that they get on their Zoom call or their Google Hangouts, or they're doing their Google Classroom work, you know, unless they have that parent right there, then the self-motivation is really important. So anything that you can do to provide them with opportunities to create agency and autonomy will serve them really well in a remote learning environment, because then they will have that intrinsic motivation to kind of want to progress through and learn, because they'll be engaged. Equity, choice, and flexibility. These play into the previous piece about engagement. When you have options for student choice and you offer them flexibility, you offer them a say in what they're going to learn about, even if it's just an option of 5 things you can pick and 5 different ways you could present your knowledge, you know, it still gives them that ability to pick. They no longer are relegated to writing an essay. You know, they could do a podcast, they could do, you know, a video recording, and they can still demonstrate the competencies of ELA by writing a script for their video or writing a script for their podcast, but it changes the format and can really offer them some more flexibility in how they are progressing with their learning. So, okay, let's see. Trying to hit next. And okay, this is one thing that is quite different in a remote learning environment, and that is feedback on student work. Depending on how you do things in the classroom, you might have already been integrating a tool that allows you to provide feedback on student work. But for a lot of people, this is new. They're used to kind of just providing verbal feedback or written comments in an essay or things of that nature. So being really thoughtful with your feedback on student work becomes a valuable thing in remote learning. Students are isolated. You want to keep in mind that isolation impact. So feedback from you becomes a form of communication at that point. It's not just great job. You know, they're looking to have that interaction with you, even if it's an asynchronous interaction. So not saying that you need to provide, you know, lengthy feedback to every assignment, but it needs to be a deliberate consideration of how you will provide your students with feedback when you're in a remote environment, because it's not organic like it is in the classroom. You also want to keep in mind timing and method. You don't want to overwhelm students with your feedback. You don't want to overwhelm yourself with assigning yourself feedback to students that you can't, you know, keep up with, or that's going to kill you to keep up with. You want to keep feedback specific and focused. Always keep it positive in nature when possible. You know, that compliment sandwich. Give them something good, then tell them something they could work on, and then something else that they did well. And that just plays into that isolation piece. You know, you're not there to convey, well, and sometimes you are. Maybe you're providing video feedback, and then that's different. But if you're just writing feedback, you're not there to convey emotion or tone. So the words that you use become really important in those moments. So anytime that you can be really thoughtful about that, that's great. And building in a space for peer feedback is something that often goes kind of by the wayside in remote learning. I think there's a lot of fear surrounding students not providing constructive feedback or just saying good job to everyone. So anytime you can build in a framework for establishing norms for peer feedback and then kind of going through that process, you're really providing your students with agency in that point, because then they will recognize how to provide feedback on their own work as well as others and keep it very positive focused. So I'm a big proponent for peer feedback in remote learning experiences. There is a really phenomenal tool online called PeerGrade if you're actually doing papers where you're doing feedback. And you can also do a similar thing with Google Docs with the comments and things of that nature. So there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of get that feedback narrative going back and forth. So just kind of keep in mind how feedback could play a role in preventing students from feeling isolated. Can you use, you know, both peer feedback and feedback on student work to provide them with that feeling of being engaged with you as their instructor, engaged with their class material, and engaged with other students when possible. So collaboration among students, this kind of plays into that last piece about peer feedback that I was talking about. Establishing student expectations for collaboration is like the golden ticket to having success with group work, with, you know, any type of collaboration. You want to let them know what they're expected of, what their roles are. Sometimes you might refrain from assigning roles because you want students to kind of work that out between themselves, but you might let them know what the roles are so that they can kind of know, okay, one person is going to be the note taker, one person's going to be the creator, one person's going to be the designer, you know, like, and I'm just throwing stuff out there, but that idea that when you set the groundwork for the expectations, then especially in a remote learning environment, then you'll have more success, because clear expectations are a real, I like to say you can't over communicate in a remote learning environment, which of course you can, but only just barely. More communication is definitely better than less, especially when it comes to instruction. Providing varied options for collaboration, different types of activities, different ways that they're working together, whether it's discussions, whether it's group projects, whether it's collaborating on a shared resource document where they're supposed to find a news article about a topic, and each, you know, don't put a news article that's already been posted type of deal. So they're collaborating asynchronously, and it doesn't even involve the coordination of establishing roles or anything, because they're just kind of like doing an information dump in the same place. So that is a form of collaboration in a remote setting, and they'll definitely end up feeling more engaged in a moment like that, because they'll see that they're adding to this thing that is bigger than themselves. And the final piece here, which I'm sure everyone has heard quite a bit about in the past few months, is the social and emotional learning component in a remote environment. It has to be integrated into remote learning. It's hard to make SEL an add-on. So anytime that you can create learning activities that support socio-emotional learning, including discussion of it in your synchronous class sessions. I like to talk about that with digital literacy. Some of those things you should just talk about as a class and kind of have those discussions, bring it to the forefront of their mind. Students may not understand some of the experiences that they're having in this remote learning environment. So sometimes talking about it, you know, as a class can help to bring those thoughts for them and help them learn in that way. And providing opportunities and space for student sharing. That is something that I don't want to say it never happens in remote learning, but in a lot of ways, that's something that ends up kind of going sideways, is having a place where students can come together and share, you know, just stuff they find cool or interesting, kind of that ability for them to share back and forth between each other. There's a lot of learning management systems that don't lend themselves well to that type of engagement. So just kind of brainstorming on how you might try to navigate that with the tools that you have is great. You know, the isolating nature of remote learning makes it so that SEL, you know, it really needs to be integrated and incorporated into everything that you're doing kind of daily, versus just being something that gets talked about on the side. And so I would like to pause for a moment and just open the floor for questions, thoughts about these principles. And then I've got a quick activity that we can do as well.
I have a question about the social emotional learning. So if a student is reporting very difficult times, what do we do with that information?
So that's a really great question. I would say that there's some context there that would need to be known to know exactly what you would do. But I would say that the same protocols that you have in place in your school would be kind of that process that you would use. You usually would have contacts that you would connect them with. And so you would kind of go through that same process. But one thing I like to recommend is that people in their syllabus or in their class like information page, where however you house it, that you put resources for students to find on their own. And that if they express something, non-life threatening type of deal, like if they're just struggling and, you want to connect them with somebody, but you don't want to reach out around them, then you could direct them to that page that you have, here's some great resources that you as a student have access to, feel free to check them out. I think that you have to scaffold up from there depending on what the student expresses, to you. And then of course you would have to reach out to the other individuals if it's something more serious. John, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I was going to say, I think one of the things to be thinking about, and I know definitely at like the middle school, high school level, I mean, you have those little check-ins with students every day. Kids are kind of just coming through and you're chit-chatting with them. And it can be a really valuable way to kind of assess how kids are doing, whether they're having a rough day or something, but you can kind of see those trends over time. And you don't necessarily have those mechanisms in place. So I think that's why having, any opportunities to kind of check in with students, even if it's, if you have a form or something that they're filling out that, maybe they're putting in an emoji to kind of say how they're feeling that day. I think any of those little pieces that you can include, even if they're small, and actually maybe especially if they're small, because then it's not as, kind of shining a light on that. But I think having those pieces in there can help you in terms of evaluating, where students' heads at and what challenges they might be having. And some students, they will reach out to you, or if they're not getting work done and you reach out to them, some of them are just going to say, I'm having a really hard time right now with getting this work done. And there's just a lot going on. And I mean, it might be just related to kind of the isolation situation right now, but I think in remote learning, in a more planned remote learning situation, it could just be, life has popped up and that isn't always, as obvious. So I think having those mechanisms in place, and if they're just something that you do with some regularity, students aren't necessarily going to, I guess they're not going to see it as like this thing that they have to do and it's kind of a big deal. It's just kind of a little check-in. And I've seen a ton of teachers have just different little ways that they've checked in with their students. And I think any seasoned educator, you have those little things that you're looking for, those red flags. And obviously we don't have the face-to-face communication. Sometimes you just have to look harder or have places where those flags can be staked.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, speaks to the isolation piece is that idea that students want to feel heard. So I think anytime that you can give them a safe place to do that, that's a really great thing. And like John's mentioning, that idea of like an exit ticket or exit survey, like a quick 2 or 3, maybe 5 questions, how are you feeling? Pick an emoji to represent how you're feeling type of deal. Like anything like that will help them to just feel heard. And that will just, I think that does wonders for, a student who feels isolated. Because we all sit here in these meetings and sometimes you'll have thoughts and you won't share them. And then, if you go on for an entire day like that, or, you get the question, does anybody have any questions? And there's so many questions, you never get called on, in a remote learning environment, some of those things can be a lot harder to pick up on as an instructor. So anytime that you can kind of make a space for those things to be shared with you, I think is a great practice.
And I think also, and some people brought this up in the chat, having opportunities that kids can kind of just come together and socialize. I mean, I've heard about after school programs that are happening right now, and they're essentially just Zoom rooms that kids can get onto and do some activities together. And I think one of the things to be kind of considering is there might be some opportunities for those things to happen and for them to be successful, and maybe those, you know, might carry over. Even if we go back to a brick and mortar school, there might be some opportunities there for things to like that to continue or develop.
So I'm just looking back through the chat for a moment, make sure I didn't miss too many things. One thing I would like to just speak to is that Noah wrote in the chat, a task that takes a lot of work in the classroom is to instruct students how to give good feedback to their peers. Could you talk a little bit about some strategies to help students learn this skill in a distance learning environment? I just want to kind of talk about that for a quick moment. One thing that I really like to emphasize for remote learning is the concepts of digital citizenship. This is something we kind of dug into last week on Wednesday, I think it was. And those recordings will be posted, so if you want to dig into that, feel free. But anytime that you can build the concepts of citizenship and digital citizenship into your remote classroom, some of those, the do's and don'ts of appropriate peer feedback will be learned intrinsically through that material as you're integrating digital citizenship into your classroom and kind of talking about some of those things that go along with it, cyberbullying and those things. Students will pick up on the idea of what is okay to say and what is not okay to say in some of the more broader perspectives. So that can be a really great way to frame that. But then on the more micro perspective of the actual feedback piece, one thing that I like to suggest is that you have a sample document that everyone gives feedback to, like something that nobody in the class wrote, you don't know whose it is, or maybe you say it's yours and you let them give feedback on you. It doesn't matter as long as no one in the class is invested in it. And then you have them all provide feedback on this one document, and then you go through the feedback and discuss like which ones were really constructive and helpful, which ones kind of didn't really give us much to go on and work with. And then you can kind of analyze feedback in a more safe space. You could even anonymize the responses so that students don't feel like they're being called out on which feedback they gave. But doing that as a group activity before you unleash them on other students' work can be really helpful for both setting expectations and kind of establishing that groundwork of what peer feedback really should look like. What is it when it's effective versus just great job or this sentence stinks? You know, those are not really great peer feedback examples. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. Okay, I'm gonna find my PowerPoint. We have a little mentee meter kind of poll that we wanted to do, talking about these 7 instructional design principles. We're interested in kind of gaining an understanding of where people are at with these and their level of comfort and understanding of them in a remote learning environment. So there's the www.mentee.com, and then you have the 320886, and John is awesome, so he just put it in the chat. And I'm gonna open that on my computer so you can kind of see results as they get populated. And these will, it just is gonna show the results of the group as people respond, kind of which concepts we are most comfortable with. Hopefully.
Okay, I think I missed something. I was typing and I guess I can't listen and type at the same time. So what do I do with this code?
Go to mentee.com, and we're gonna be filling out this. I'm getting ready to try to share it on the screen. It's just a quick little poll to see kind of how people are feeling with these 7 different instructional design principles. So you see the mentee.com and then the 3, 2.
Yeah. How do I choose? Just click on one?
Yep, so there's the little dots that show up. I don't have it open as a participant. I should. I'll show you what it looks like.
So I need to go someplace else.
No, I think you're in the right place. I mean, I can't see your screen, so I can't say for sure, but one sec.
I have Mentimeter. Please enter the code.
Okay, yep. So put in that code and hit enter, and then it's going to show you these, and you can slide it.
Oh, I can't, but I can't move them. I think I've missed something. Oh dear.
That's bizarre.
You have to actually go to your web browser and go to mentee.com.
Okay, see, I was wondering about that.
Not on the shared screen.
Oh, okay.
I just clicked the link in the chat box that John put up. There's a link to the website. Just click the link.
Right. Yes, good. Thank you. Uh-oh. Tell me the code again.
320886.
320886.
Yep.
Was that a pen I heard?
Okay.
I know what would have been interesting if I'd really been thinking would be to have asked what everyone's comfort level with this was in February and what it is now, because I bet that would show you some interesting stuff.
I think one of the points that we've been trying to make during this series, because a lot of it seems kind of like, why are we having these discussions about things that we've kind of been living through? And I think one of the things to recognize is that the remote learning that people have been doing in the past few months, that is not an ideal scenario in any shape or form. You know, people were scrambling to get technology out to kids, scrambling to pull their stuff together and get online, learning, you know, Zoom or Google Meet for the first time. What are protocols? Like all of those different pieces, people were having to, by and large, learn on the fly. So I think it's important to know, yeah, just showed up in the chat, it's crisis learning. So I think that's one of the things to recognize, that taking some time to step back, maybe there were some successes along the way that you can say, you know, I thought this went really well, or students seemed receptive to this, but also to be, you know, very honest in that, you know, this didn't work out or that didn't work out. If I need to do this in the fall, what are some changes that I might need to make? What are some, you know, what's some learning that I need to do to prepare myself? And hopefully, you know, we have that opportunity to do that. I think one of the things the commissioner said several times recently, you know, the first time you have an emergency, it's a genuine emergency. The second time, if you have that same situation, I mean, you need to have a plan the second time around. So I think that's hopefully the phase that we're in now, is that we can kind of work on making these plans. And Emma and I have really tried to think, how can we plan this in a way so that teachers can pivot with whatever happens? So we're not showing you tools that you have to use exclusively in the remote learning situation we're doing now. Most of these you could easily use in a regular classroom or within some of the models that are going on.
Is there a reason that I can't see your screen anymore? All I see is participants.
So you will have to probably find your Zoom icon.
Go back in.
Yep, and if you usually if you just click the Zoom logo, which is the little blue square with a white camera on it, then it should pop back up.
I know I kind of feel a little frustrated with doing this now and then sitting on it for a couple months. I mean, ideally, I'm going to, you know, look into it and stuff, but I really wish we could have done all this uploading a week before school started instead of now. I mean, it seems like we'd know more about what was going to happen.
Yep. And I think that's one of the challenges.
You know, it's all kinds of really neat.
I think some schools right now, they are kind of doing that planning. Other schools, I think they're going to kind of have kind of that grace period. And I hope everybody has some time in July to just recharge their batteries.
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the big things, is that I think this is really exhausting. And it's, I mean, we talking about SEL stuff. I mean, teachers need to really spend some time taking care of themselves and making sure that they're able to, you know, hopefully give it their physical and emotional all in the fall, whatever it looks like. And I think we're just trying to get so this session, I mean, part of it's being recorded so people can access it in, you know, in the coming months.
Still trying to get back into your room.
Can I just share one thing? Someone just posted in the chat about when are people preparing this, now or in August. So I just wanted to share about what our school is doing, which is preparing now under the assumption that at some point we will be teaching remotely again. So whether that's because we are in a hybrid model in the fall, or because at some point there is we have an outbreak in our building, or one person in our building has COVID and we need to shut, or there's a greater outbreak in the state of Maine and we all have to go back to remote learning for some period of time. So I think, you know, working under the assumption that having this in your back pocket and ready to go is going to be really crucial for schools. Just sharing, I don't work for the CDC or the DOE, but just from my perspective as a school leader and administrator, just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think also in the idea of snow days and things of that nature too, you know, if this is working well for schools, I don't think they're just going to be like, all right, let's just toss that out of here now. So any of this stuff is definitely worth knowing for sure. Okay, so.
I'm still not in. I'm sorry. I keep clicking this Zoom icon and it's not taking me anywhere.
Try looking around your screen for the little tiny menu that has like the 9 squares or the 2.
Yeah, I got that.
So can you try toggling one of those? That should let you see, that should change your view. Sounds like maybe you've got it stuck in like a minimized mode.
Yeah, maybe. I have a little icon of your thing, but not a big one. Let's see. I just don't want to take your time. I just want you to know I can't see what you're showing me or chat.
Yeah.
At the bottom of that picture, if you can see Emma, then at the very bottom, right bottom, click on that. There might be a little icon that will enlarge it for you.
I have an arrow which shows me other people. Hi, Renee. And I have the 9 box and the 2 box and the 1 box. It says show share.
You have other screens open.
Phalia, this is Renee. There should be a box at the top that says swap shared screen with video, and it should be by the box that has 9 little on it. Click on that.
I do that, and I have her screen, but I don't have, it's really small. I don't have other people in it.
Click it again, and it should make her screen large and your video small.
Well, either way, I've only got one more slide, and you will get it in email. So you're only going to miss like 4 points, and I'm going to read them. So don't worry about it.
All right.
Okay, so no worries at all. I want to be respectful of people's time. We've only got 4 minutes. Okay, so just kind of circling back around, we've got our remote design checklist. These are some of the big ideas that you want to keep in mind just overall. And that's to provide choice and variety, ensure connection and collaboration whenever possible, integrate social and emotional learning into what you're already doing, and be mindful of the medium that you're using. And by that, I mean the fact that your students are, in a lot of cases in a remote learning environment, connecting with you via a device. So just keep in mind the impact that has on both of you and your communication with the student. Their learning, the cognitive load is going to be affected by the fact that they're having to go through this medium to engage with their learning. So just be mindful of that. And then the final thing that I think we talk about a lot is trying as much as what you can to keep things simple. I know we say over communicate and, you know, provide plenty of information, and then we're like, all right, keep it simple. But it's kind of a tightrope balance between the two. You want to provide as much information as what you can, but also keeping it as simple as what you can, and as clearly designed, so that as somebody reads through something or is listening or watching something, there's a clear progression of how things are moving. And so that brings us to the questions point. Does anyone have any final thoughts or questions? We got about 2 minutes, so I think we could take a couple questions. John just shared the link to the certificate form in the chat, and I'll also share it on the screen in just a moment. But I just want to see if anyone has any final questions about the stuff we've talked about today. Alrighty. Well, you know how to find us now, and we will be back today at 3 p.m. talking about Google Apps. That will be a help session. So if you have questions or are trying to troubleshoot something, that's a good session to drop into. And then we'll be continuing with the Remote Learning 101 series, parts 2 and 3, tomorrow and on Thursday at 11. So we'll hope to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining us, everyone.